Okay, so as Nari sort of briefly mentioned in the first part of the workshop, one of the reasons why we want to use React is because we don't want this repetitive code structure where if you imagine we were creating something like Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, one of these social media platforms, we have all of this disgusting looking HTML code that we'd have to go through and edit. Specifically, one of the reasons why we want to use React is because we can avoid this through the use of components. But we'll go through that in a bit. Right now, let's do a crash course on div since I forgot to cover this in the first workshop. But essentially, divs are another sort of tag that was originally used in HTML, but they're used to section together code. And that's literally like the entire purpose of a div. So if you look at this div here, it contains two p tags within it. So this div is basically just here to serve as a container. It doesn't actually modify anything that shows up on the page, though you can use it later if you want to have maybe like a class for the div, and then that would apply for everything within the div as well. That's one of the reasons why you would use a div. But a lot of the things that we're going to be doing in React have to do with these divs, especially because later on we'll see how the components interact with divs as well. All right, does anyone have questions about divs before I go on? No? All right, nice. So next up, let's talk about what are components. As I sort of spoiled a bit earlier, components are a way that we can avoid this reuse of code or rewriting of code over and over, as we saw with the earlier examples. So essentially what we are going to use a component for is that we can use it to sort of store part of the website that we want to create. So what's shown here is what's called a functional component. And the reason it's called a functional component is because it sort of looks like a function, right? You have the word function, but actually this is a component. And we know that it is a component because we're working on React. And also you see here that it's returning some JSX. So breaking down this functional component, first of all, we have the name of the component, which is also the name of the function in this case. And the return of this function is going to be the JSX, which we want to basically render into our page. So yeah, any questions about the component so far? I noticed that was kind of quick, but I'll be doing like a demo later on. So don't worry if you have too many questions. But yeah, the big thing to note here about components as well is that you only are able to return one JSX element from a component. So when I mentioned divs earlier, how they're used to group together different components or just elements in general, one of the reasons why we'd want to use divs is because when we're returning one element, we can just return a div that contains other elements. So in that way, we can render multiple things instead of just one thing at a time. Okay, so I'll be doing a quick demo in this workshop just to show you guys how to use components and things like that. I'd recommend for this section that you guys actually don't code along because spoiler will have a coding exercise at the end for you guys to work on something similar, but rather just take note on some of the concepts and things like that. For the demo itself, I'm going to be creating Litter, which is a garbage version of Twitter. It's basically going to be a simplified version that just has like posts. Actually, it just has one post since I'm just creating one component. But yeah, let's dive into that. So first of all, I have this React app set up. I'll zoom in a bit so you guys can see. It's pretty much what you guys have, but I have this images folder, which contains images that I'll use later in the demo. First of all, whenever you're working with components, you want to create a new folder within the source folder to store all of these components. So this is just really good for organization of our code. You can imagine if we were a big company and we wanted to create like hundreds of components, we wouldn't want them all scattered in the source folder. So I'm just going to name it components. And within our components folder, we can actually create the component that we want. As I mentioned, I'm going to be creating sort of like a Twitter post. So I'm just going to call the component post.js. So even though this is JS, we want to define that we're actually going to be working with React stuff by writing an import line at the top. So we're going to be writing line import React from React. So don't worry too much about what this does. It basically defines that in this file, we're going to be working with like React stuff. And now we can actually start defining the functional component that I talked about earlier. So we'll start off with function and then the name of the component. It's common that we want the name of the function to match the name of the file as well. And this is just to sort of define what's going to be within the file is the name of the file. So within this function, let's just create a really simple return. First of all, let's just say it's a header. All right, cool. So this is going to be our functional component right here. I already have the React app running in the development server. So I have it over here. I'll have this on the side so you guys can see it. Let me get this sorted. So yeah, you'll see that right now, even if I save this file, nothing really happens. And the reason for that is, well, we haven't actually told React how to render this new component that we're using. However, in order to do that, we have this new concept, which is importing and exporting. So we covered importing a bit earlier. Basically, we just want to move parts of files over. So for example, we could import the CSS file for our app. However, we also can import components from other files. So this is another syntax, I guess, a way of importing. Instead of just writing importing with a file afterward, you import something from a file. So in this case, we want to import the post component from our post.js file. However, in order to allow the post to be imported into another file, well, we need to export our post. So the line that we want to write at the bottom of our post.js file is export default post, which basically just means that we want to be able to use this component in another file. So we'll export it and then import it into another file. An analogy that I'd like to think of for like importing and exporting is like airdrop. If you guys have ever interacted with that, for example, if someone's trying to share you an image, they want to export it to you, and then you're importing it into your photo library or wherever it may be. Yeah, let's see how that works within the app itself. As I mentioned here, we want to write the line export default post. And now even when I save the file, nothing really happens. And we have to import it over in our app to actually have it show up. So this app.js file is sort of like what's actually being rendered. So if you don't have anything within the app.js file saying that we want to render this post, obviously nothing's going to show up. So just copying the syntax over from the slide, it's going to be import post from, and then let me explain this path here that I have. So what I've written here, this part of the actual import statement is the path to whatever file that we want to import from. So if you look at this dot slash part of it first, just to open up the file directory so we can see it, you'll notice that the app.js file and the app.css file are in the same folder. So in order to import the CSS file, we want to first write the dot, which means the current folder that we're in, and then slash to say a file within that folder, and then app.css, which is the name of the file. So that's similar to what we're doing with the post. However, the post is not in the exact same folder that we're currently in. So instead, we're going to write dot slash, which means this current folder, and then within this folder, we have the components folder. So the folder that app.js is in is a source folder, and then within that, we have the components folder. And then within the components folder, we have post.js, which is the actual file we're trying to import from. Once we have this import set up, we can actually start using the post component. So the post component is going to look sort of like the HTML tags that we covered before. So what I can write here is just return post and then have it be self-closing with the semicolon at the end. And now when I go back, you'll see it says narrate is cool, which is exactly what we have defined in this post.js file. I can change this as well to say like Nare is super cool. And you'll see that it continually updates. So now that we have this set up, we can begin actually working on the post and it should change along the way. So let's get rid of this, but instead we're going to use a div as I mentioned earlier. And the reason for this div is that we can only return one JSX element from this post. However, we want to actually have multiple things within the post, right? The post isn't just going to be one thing. So to start off the post, I'm going to have a p tag at the beginning just to have the username and name of the person. So in this case, I'm going to use strong in order to bold the text that says Eric. And then I'm also going to put the @ this is actually my Instagram handle since I don't use Twitter, but don't worry about that. And then next up, I'm going to have sort of the caption for my post. So it's also going to be a paragraph. And I'm just going to write, I got BTS tickets. All right. And you'll see that this is what shows up currently, which looks all right. Looks like the end is sort of cut off. So I'll sort of move that over. But yeah, after that, I'm going to have an image for my post as well. So that's going to be an image here. And I have to define a few things within my image. First of all, let's do the source of the image. So images kind of work differently in React as well. We actually have to import them over into our file. So just to look at the file directory really quick, I have this images folder, and then I have this bts.jpg, which actually has the photo that I want in my post. So I'm going to import this image over. So line for that is going to be import ticket image from, and then dot. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to be using dot dot, and dot dot actually means the parent folder. So if you look at this file structure really quickly, right now this post is in the components folder, but we actually want to go up one level to the source folder because then we can go down into the images and such. So it's going to be from dot dot slash images slash bts.jpg. And then here, when I'm actually going to try to render the image, I can just use the source attributes that we sort of discussed in the HTML workshop. However, in this case, instead of having just like a link or something like that, I can just use tickets image here directly for the source of the image. So yeah, the image is kind of big. Don't worry about that. We'll work on styling after we get all the content in. Also have some alternate text, which is going to be BTS tickets. All right, so after the image of a post, there's sort of like the reaction section where you can like an image or share an image, comment on an image, things like that. I don't have time to implement like the actual functionality of all that, but we're just going to put in a few icons just to simulate that sort of feature. So within my images folder, I have a few icons as well. Comments, which is a text bubble, hearts, which is like for the like, and then like retweet, I guess, which is this other symbol. But yeah, we're going to import those as well at the top first. So it's going to be import comment from here, comment.png. And then I'll just copy paste this a few times for the other ones. For example, like retweet. And also heart, which I'm going to call like. Okay, so now that we have all of these icons, I'm going to take like a warning step, I guess, or like a cautionary step and put these all in a div, because I know that later on I'm going to want to style them all together. So the div is going to just contain all of the icons within it. So it's going to be similar to the image that I just created. But this time, instead of being tickets image, it's going to be whatever we want for the actual picture. So in this case, I'm going to do the comment icon first, and then the retweet, and then the like, for instance. So we want the alternate text as well for the comment. And then I'll copy paste this a few times for the retweet. And also the like. So note that these names right here in the source have to match exactly to what I imported the images as. So in this case, comment, retweet, and like at the top have to match exactly with comment, retweet, and like for the source of the images. Now, if I save this and go back, all right, you'll see that we have these icons at the bottom. They're not all sized properly. So let's actually work on sort of the CSS for this post. So for each of our components, we actually want to create a new CSS file for it. And the reason that we want to do this is because, as I mentioned earlier, with like creating separate files just for components, we also want to separate the CSS that applies to just any one component. We don't want all of our CSS to be bunched together in one big file. So I'm going to create a new file here for post.css. And let's actually import it really quick to the post.js file as well. So in this case, I can just directly write /post.css since I'm importing the file directly from the current directory that post is in. Now, I'm not able to style any of these without classes. So let's actually work on some of the classes for the post as well. In this case, I'm going to have a class for the overall div, which is just containing the entire post. The class name is just going to be post. I'm also going to have a class for the div, which contains all of the images. So in this case, the class name will just be reaction-bar. And finally, for each of these images, I also want them to have a class, the images being the actual icons that we have, like the comment, retweet, and heart. So their class is going to be reaction. Now, finally, I'm going to have a class name for the actual image that's like the main part of the post as well. So this one is just going to be called post image. All right, now we're ready to start styling parts of our post. So I'll start with the overall post itself. Let's say that we want a border on our post just to see where it begins and ends, things like that. Note that for this entire like CSS portion, you shouldn't know most of these like off the top of your head. I had to search some of these up as well. So it's completely fine if you don't know like all these completely memorized. But for the border, I'm going to find that I want it to be 2 pixels wide. And then the type of border I want is a solid border. And the color of the border I want is going to be light gray. And now when we go back to our page, it's a bit hard to see, but you'll see that very close to the top of the screen, there's this light gray border that goes around. It actually doesn't even contain the entire image that we have here, but we'll fix that in just a second. Let's also define a width for our post to just be 500 pixels, which is just an arbitrary number. So you'll see that this post is sort of squished into the corner of the screen. And you can tell because I'm sort of dragging this post out from the corner, but this border is right up on the corner of the page. So I'm actually going to put a margin from the side. So the margin is just going to be 20 pixels. And now it's a bit spaced out from the side as well. I'll work on some of the other classes now. So the reason why I wanted to put a class for the div, which contains all of the reaction stuff, is so that I can style all of them here. So I'm actually going to be using the combining selectors, which we showed at the first workshop for CSS. Basically what combining selectors means, for those of you guys who might have not been here, is that we can style both the class here, but I also want to style just a specific element within the class. So I'll just follow that up with image. And what this basically means is that I want to style all of the images that are within the class reaction bar. So this will just apply to all of the smaller reactions that we have, like the heart, comment, and such. So I want to make the height of all of these 50 pixels. And you'll see that they're a relatively better size, but they're sort of like crammed at the top. So I'm going to give them a margin from the top as well of 20 pixels. All right. Now I can also style the images directly by just using the class selector that I applied to all of the images. The class in this case is just reaction. And since these images are a bit squished, like right next to each other, I'm going to give them a margin on the left of 85 pixels. A lot of this work is going to be like guess and check. I sort of did the guess and check already, so I know the numbers. But when you're actually working on this on your own, you will sort of just like play around with the numbers and see what looks about right. And finally, I also want to style the image for the post since it's pretty big right now. How I'm going to style it is I'm going to set the width to 100%. And what that actually means, the 100% is referring to the actual container that it's in. So this is another reason why the divs may be useful. Since this post image is contained within the outermost div that contains our entire post, what this 100% refers to is it's going to span basically the entire width of our post. So in this case, doesn't seem like it's working quite well. Oh, the actual class I think is post image, not image. Okay, yeah, there we go. So now we have the image styled so that it fits directly between like the two borders on the side. You can sort of see that here. So it's filling up 100% of the width of the post. I also noticed that the images and sort of like the text and stuff is close to the border. So I'm going to add in padding of 20 pixels. And now you'll see that everything is sort of more nicely spaced out from the border. And yeah, that pretty much wraps up small creation of a component. However, to show that we can actually use this component over and over, if we go back to our app.js file, right now we're just rendering one post. But the reason why creating this component was useful is that instead of rendering just one post, we can actually render several posts at once. So here, I can just copy paste this, let's say 3 times. And now if we go back to the page, you'll see that there's 3 identical posts lined up. So if you can imagine, if you were just writing this in like raw HTML instead of actually working in React, you'd have to copy paste the HTML, all of that code like over and over in order to create these new posts. And let's say that I wanted to edit a specific part of my post. For example, let's say that we wanted all of the images or the reactions to be like 60 pixels instead of 50. I can simply change it here in this post.css file. While if we were just working in raw HTML, we have to go back and change each of our HTML posts individually, and that would create a lot more work and be super redundant. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the demo of our post. I realize I sort of went through that really quickly, but here now we have time for anyone. First of all, I'll take any questions that you guys may have about the actual components and creating components. Anyone have any questions? Yeah. Good question. So that will actually be covered in our next workshop, props and layout, which will be taught by Jody and Alex in the back over there. So yeah, come out to our next workshop to find out how to make the post different so you don't have a lame feed that just has the same post over and over. Any other questions? Nope. All right. So yeah, now we have the coding exercise portion of the workshop. So what the coding exercise is for today is that I want to have each of you guys create a component in the similar manner that I did with my component. And I want you guys to just think critically about like what you can actually use this component to represent. The whole reason that we want to create this component is for like reusability and like functionality, things like that, that's sort of shared between all these elements. So for example, if you look at like Instagram, for example, and you wanted to break it down to components, how would you break it down? Like think about these things before you start like coding. So if you guys want to just like do the same thing that I did sort of creating like a post on a social media site, you can do that. But you can also just think about like where else in the world, I guess, you've seen like reusable parts of websites that you'd want to create a component for. So yeah, we'll give you guys sort of like 10 to 15 minutes or however long you may need to work on this, but that's sort of like the end, official end of the workshop. If you guys are planning on leaving, we want you guys to fill out the feedback form in the beginning of the slides. Yeah, the feedback form. I can write this on the board as well, but it's links.uclaacm.com/hackschool21-s3-feedback. So yeah, that's it for the workshop. Feel free to work on your components and stay. Mentors will be helping, so feel free to wave them down if you need help.